Hello again and welcome back to the parsonage. It's Pastor Don from First United Methodist Church of Brazoria, and here's another stay-at-home daily devotional. Friends, do you remember as a child having to take an afternoon nap? Remember after lunch we'd lay down for an hour or so of enforced rest, and then we'd get back up and return to our childhood activities. We didn't want to take our nap. We were made to, remember? Well, jump forward to present day adulthood. Oh, don't you just wish someone would make you take an afternoon nap? I mean, naps as an adult are sublime and desirable. The best nap I have all year is the one that follows lunch on Easter Sunday. All the services and activities of Holy Week are now behind me, and deep restorative sleep beckon. I love naps and sure would welcome somebody to require me to take a daily one. So what if I told you God has essentially ordered us to rest regularly and for good? What if I told you that God commanded us to take a rest on a regular basis? Well, guess what? God has. It's called Sabbath. You'll find it explicitly in the Ten Commandments in the 20th chapter of Exodus, right between God's commandment not to take His name in vain and the one about honoring your father and your mother. The law says, quote, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work." Literally, God is commanding us to set aside 1 day a week, 1 in 7, to rest. And God even used the example of the days of creation as an example of how He kept Sabbath. "Do as I do," says God. And this, friends, is not just physical rest, but spiritual rest as well. It's time for both our bodies and our souls to recuperate and prepare for the next week. Martin Luther wrote, quote, "The spiritual rest which God particularly intends in this commandment is this, that we not only cease from our labor and trade, but much more, that we let God alone work in us, and that we do nothing of our own with all our powers," unquote. See, Sabbath is God's time to work in us while we rest. And friends, as a commandment, this is not supposed to be an optional practice. So for all nap lovers out there like me, here you go. Sabbath is not only permission, but formal direction to rest, and not just a 1 to 2 hour nap, but a full 24-hour rest once a week. Okay, I know someone's going to message me or whatever and remind me of Romans 6:14 regarding the authority of the law of the Old Testament, of which the Ten Commandments are part. St. Paul correctly wrote, quote, you are not under law, but under grace." So friends, if you want to talk yourself out of this God-given rest like we tried avoiding our naps as kids, well, here's your argument. It's not a very good one. Because even Paul himself was not going to leave the law behind completely. You see, he was a Pharisee, and he reminds us in Philippians that he kept the law of Moses without blame. But then he asked the Romans, should we sin because we're not under law but under grace? And he answers, by no means. Rather, to Paul, it was about graceful obedience of God, not the law. Justification and ultimately righteousness come from God's grace, not simply from law keeping. Now, we're still not supposed to murder, steal, lie, commit adultery, take the Lord's name in vain, and so forth. And yes, we are supposed to keep the Sabbath, but we don't. Like a pile of unopened presents left alone in a corner covered with dust, we ignore this commandment and we keep on keeping on with our busyness. Friends, how do we as Christians mend our ways, and keep Sabbath? Well, our Jewish neighbors, as you know, have set aside the same 24-hour period for Sabbath since antiquity. From sundown Friday until sundown on Saturday, they rest. Now, depending upon the degree of orthodoxy each person practices, the amount of allowable activity they may perform during this time, well, it can vary, but they are to refrain from most all work. Remember the story of Jesus' disciples and how they were soundly criticized for plucking wheat grains off the stalk as a snack when they were hungry on a Saturday, a Sabbath. Now, to be most clear, Christians try, it seems, to observe Sunday, the day of resurrection, as our holy day, although most folks these days do all sorts of work on Sunday, from mowing the lawn to shopping, etc. So when then is our Sabbath? I mean, friends, it can be hard to keep a day if we can't decide when it is. And here the power of Jesus' reply to the critics of the wheat grain plucking on the Sabbath can be helpful. Jesus said, quote, "The Sabbath was made for humankind and not the humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is the Lord even of the Sabbath." So it's our Sabbath gift to us from God. So we can choose the time and place of our Sabbath. Sunday can be great, but it doesn't work for everyone. And nowadays, so many people work 7-day weeks with rotating shifts that a variable Sabbath day is, well, it's an absolute necessity. So here's my simple advice about Sabbath keeping. Pick a day and keep Sabbath. The Reverend Dr. Barbara Brown Taylor gives this advice, and I love how she says this. At least one day out of 7, she writes, quote, "Pull off the road, park the car in the garage, close the door to the tool shed, and turn off the computer." Imagine that. Quote, "Stay at home, not because you're sick, but because you're well, and talk someone you love into being well with you. Take a nap, a walk, an hour for lunch. Test the premise," she says, "that you're worth more than you can produce. That even if you spent one whole day of being good for nothing, you would still be precious in God's sight." And then she reminds us, and when you get anxious because you're convinced that this is not so, remember that your own conviction is not required. This is a commandment. She continues, "Your worth has already been established, even when you are not working." So friends, the when is less important than the do. Being with God is vital, and not doing. Remember, we're human beings after all, and not human doings. Take time to be with God. The late Dr. Eugene Peterson, the author of the Message translation of the Bible, says this about Sabbath. He said, quote, "Sabbath is that uncluttered time and space in which we can distance ourselves from our own activities enough to see what God is doing." He continues, "Sabbath is not primarily about us or how it even benefits us. It's about God and how God forms us. It is not, in the first place," he said, "about what we do or don't do. It's about God completing, resting, blessing, sanctifying." And he says these are all things we don't know much about. But he says it does mean stopping. Our souls are formed by what we cannot work up or take charge of. Rather, we respond and enter into what the resurrection of Jesus continues to do. Sabbath then is a resurrection of sorts. Our souls are resuscitated, our bodies mended, and our faith refilled. It is needed downtime from the busyness of the demands of the world so that we might glimpse the eternal uptime with God. Simply put, it's God's unique gift to each of us, a taste of heaven, a deliberate 24-hour immersion in grace, love, and peace. Maybe it's time we made an appointment for the ultimate good day every week. Time to leave the rat race and be found quiet and calm by our God who loves us so much. Instead of a 2-hour nap, friends, let's try spending a whole day with Him this week and every week. As our Jewish neighbors say, Shabbat Shalom, the peace of the Sabbath be with you. God bless.